You being all spread them out.
Welcome to the Rapid Reviews. A lot of you have been here before, so you know that what we're going to do is just go, hopefully you all have a list. If you don't, hear more over there. And we're just going to go through the list and review them in the order. Usually they're in the order of the author's last name, but we made a couple mistakes by putting spaces and stuff. So we're just still going to keep this as our list. Feel free to also take a golf pencil if you want to write yourself notes. All of these books will be available for checkout after the event, and there are 2 checkout stations, so you can check them out for the summer. There are a couple exceptions. There's one that I had to steal back from a student and she needs it back. There's a note on it. There's one that we couldn't find to purchase it, and there's another that I recalled and it didn't make its way back.
It's
so
in the wind.
Yeah, so any of those, or if someone beats you to a book that you really want, you can put it on hold. We can help you with that. Either Beth or Rachel can help you with that at the end. And then you'll be the first person to get it after the person returns it. Let's see. So there will be a minute for each review. And I try not to be too careful about it. If someone is in the middle of a thought, they can finish their thought and then we move on to the next one. And let's see. Okay, I think that's just about it. One thing I wanted to let you know about is that next December is going to be the 10th anniversary of the first Rapid Reviews. So we've had them twice a year for 10 years. So far we've had, after these guys have reviewed, we've had 105 different reviewers. We've reviewed 928 books and probably consumed about 24 pounds of chocolate chips. So we're thinking of maybe trying to mix it up a little next semester to celebrate the 10-year anniversary. One idea that we're kicking around is having 60 reviewers review 1 book each. So, and if we did that, yes. So
Takes a community.
Exactly. So if we do that, then we're going to open the doors to anyone, even if they've been a reviewer before, maybe even especially if they've been a reviewer before. Alums, we're going to see how many alumni we can get back to review a book. Faculty, of course, staff, of course, and current students, of course. So so if you're interested in reviewing 1 book next semester, let me know. If any of you who haven't reviewed before are interested in being a reviewer like these guys, let me know that too, because we might change our mind about next semester, or we could put you on for next spring. So let me know at the end if you're interested. So I should introduce our panelists, make it sound all official. So Cara, an alum and the assistant to the president, and SJ, director of housing, interim. Cara, student extraordinaire. No, Kayla, sorry. Got all those K's. Tim Seeger, everyone knows, art teacher. Ian Hitchcock, and Peter, and you're graduating in like a week, right? Yeah. All right. Soon to be alum. All right. So I'm gonna just sit down and let you guys do your things. I'll be the timer though.
So I guess that has me beginning.
Yeah.
Talking about Edmund Duval and a book called The Hare with Amber Eyes. This is a wonderful story of his own family. Duval is a ceramic artist, somebody whose arrangements are very simple, pared down, columnar pieces of porcelain are often shown in groups of sometimes a dozen or more at a time, in beautiful little societies of form that are often white and beautiful. I knew his work, and so I didn't know about this book when I heard about it not so long ago. And it's the story of a group of Netsuki. Netsuki I was just looking through this. My edition of it has a greater illustrated bit in the middle with lots of pictures. Netsuki are carved Japanese charms. They are often meant to be carried in your pocket. They're associated with animals. And the hare with amber eyes is the name of one of the Netsuki that his family, the Abruzzi, very large Jewish family. It's their story and how these Netsuki were preserved in the Holocaust.
That was a good save. So my first book, once I learned how to use my stopwatch, here we go, is The Phantom Tollbooth by Norton Juster. It is one that's near and dear to my heart. I discovered it when I was sitting in my local bookstore complaining about how I had nothing to do because it was raining. And the owner was like, I know a book where there's this kid who thinks that nothing good ever happens to him, that he can never do anything, and he's so bored. And then he gets this toll booth in the mail and decides, well, I'm not doing anything else, I might as well drive through here. And it takes him to, oh wait, here we go. The map without the Marlboro College owns this book seal on it. A beautiful fantasy land, mountains of ignorance, valley of sound. It's a love of words and language. You know you're in good hands when you read dialogue like, I guess I just wasn't thinking, said Milo. Precisely, shouted the dog as his alarm went off again. He's a watchdog, so a watch that's a dog. Now, you know what you must do. I'm afraid I don't, admitted Milo, feeling quite stupid. Well, continued the watchdog impatiently, since you got here by not thinking, it seems reasonable to expect that in order to get out, you must start thinking. And with that, he hopped into the car.
So these are in order?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm Sarah Jane. This book is called Whipping Girl by Julia Serrano, who is sort of like the grand deity of transgender studies, in my humble opinion, / in what other people might say also. Some of our visiting authors who've come over the past year, Imogen Biddy is one of them, like trans writers kind of look to Julia as an activist and a scholar, as someone who just helps really explain the experience of trans misogyny and being someone who privileges from misogyny as a man, because Julia Serrano was born with a male body and then lived as a queer male and then transitioned to a female, queer identified female. And so when I read this book, I was in grad school and I was doing a class on queer ethics. And I was very much like many Marlboro students, sort of a F the binary type person. And I was like, binaries just trap you. And I read this book, Julia's like, some people really need binaries when they're feeling like they were born into the wrong body. And it was a really beautiful kind of combination of personal memoir and a lot of like academic data that really helped me kind of broaden what I thought was actually a broad focus that was actually sort of narrow. So.
Next up, we have A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. This is a classic in kind of liberally left-minded circles. In it, Zinn attempts to write a history of the United States from the point of view of people whose stories generally haven't been told when we think of the conventional narrative of the US. So he talks a lot about the history of Native peoples, the history of the labor movement, immigrants, generally people who have been oppressed or marginalized in any sense. And that's why he calls it people's history rather than simply history of the United States. It's in many ways a reaction against the notion that there is one definitive narrative of US history. And it is one that is beautifully written as well. When you read this is not dry, pedantic history. It's lively prose. It feels in many times like a work of fiction. So not only is it informative, but it's also eloquent as well. And Zinn is very honest about his role as a historian who has a point of view and doesn't shy away from that.
It's you?
Yes, it is. I was wondering which one of us was first to go, and done. So, oh, wait, there we go. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. This is the omnibus. I'm gonna have to say read up to, let's say, here. The last books get really weird, but the first book is one of my favorites. In it, we follow Arthur Dent, who seconds before the Earth is destroyed to make way for a hyperspace bypass, is abducted by aliens with his friend, Ford Prefect, who picked the name to blend in, and who generally gets in a lot of adventures, hears some bad vogue on poetry, and really is hilariously British while getting everyone in danger by the fact that he needs a cup of tea. I mean, I can only scratch the surface at how zany and hilarious this book is. There's no synopsis that can do it justice. The cover's really weird. The movie was terrible, and don't let either of those things scare you. Douglas Adams he's a beautiful writer, and it's a fun ride.
So this is Confessions of a Dangerous Mind by Chuck Barris. Chuck Barris was the creator/producer of The Gong Show, The Dating Game, The Newlywed Game in the 70s. And it's subtitled An Unauthorized Autobiography, because in this book he also claims to have been working for the CIA for 20 years. He's kind of a goofy guy. It was made into a movie. Theoretically, this book was written in 1984, but it didn't surface until the movie came out. There's a lot of weirdness about it, and the book is fantastic. This is one of those books that I found in an airport on my way to California, picked it up, read it on the plane, could not put it down, missed a cab because of it. And I don't regret it whatsoever. And I think this is one of the most fun books I've read in many years, and it's a shame that I haven't read it in the past 6 years, and if no one else picks this up, I might take it home with me.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be in this company. When I read the book list, I was like, every book. I would say too, for me, all of the books I chose are not necessarily the best books ever, but they were the best books for me in a certain time in my life that taught me a big, awesome thing. And so I'm a visual artist. I have a background in printmaking. This is a book by a comic artist named Linda Barry, who's from out west, and it's called 100 Demons. And I highly recommend everyone look up Linda Barry, Linda with a Y. This book is, again, she created something when I was a senior in art school. She created something that she called autobifictionalography, and that's what I was actually kind of doing. I was making a giant atlas of my life, and it was sort of my memories, which I knew were inherently, not perfect, but also were mine, and so it was autobifictionalography. This is a book that she made after the autobifictionalography that now I can't remember the name of, but this is her doing exercises where she just found this random stone. Peter might remember it better because he did a whole class on it. But basically, this is where she's talking about autobifictionalography. Yeah. I'm going to go shorter on another one, so I'm just going to say this is one of my favorite books ever. She did this whole thing. She's writing out all of her demons. And I feel like everyone at Marlboro should and could and do this because it's just all of her stuff, getting it out.
This is A Fortunate Man by John Berger and with collaboration with Jean Moore. When you have a really busy semester and you have that one book that you have time to read? This is my first book that way, my sophomore year. It's set in rural England in the 1960s, and John Berger follows this country doctor around who he soon realizes becomes more than a doctor for the people in this town. He's kind of like the one person everyone can confide in. So the book is these series of vignettes about these people in this town, and then photos by Jean Moore of the patients. And it's one of the big reasons I got interested in storytelling and journalism, and it's very beautiful.
So I have what a lot of you probably know already, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I read it first in the summer before I started high school, and it was one of the first books that taught me about analyzing literature from a feminist point of view, and two, analyzing literature, period. So it played a huge role in my life. It's this incredible book that, like I said, I'm sure many of you know, the story of a woman who feels unimportant in Victorian England and is looking through being a governess to widen her life. It has gothic elements and romance, but the core part of the story for me is how Jane is able to explore her personality by denying what others would think of as true love, because it's more important for her to discover herself. And so when I first read it, I thought, how silly. She's found love. Why not just go with that? But then it really came to me to realize that this was a heroine to look up to who was making her own way.
It's really funny that You just reviewed that one. This is The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett, which I would describe as like Jane Eyre's little sister. So you probably know this story. It's about this girl named Mary who grew up in colonial India, whose parents died due to a cholera outbreak, and she's shipped off to live with her uncle in rural England in this like mysterious old house, not dissimilar to Mr. What's his name?
Rochester.
Rochester, right. And it's also a story of like growing into yourself. She starts out as being very contrary and cross, and starts to not only discover herself, but discover this secret garden. And I love it aesthetically because it's like this like rural England, gray and cloudy, and then spring comes and you see these little spots of color, and it's like reflected in the narrative as well. And there are other mysteries hiding in the house, just like in Jane Eyre, so it's very good, not just for children.
That was actually a book that I was considering putting on my list. When I was looking through the list, I was surprised that I hadn't put it on. So this is Mrs. Burns' Dictionary, subtitled Of Unusual, Obscure, and Preposterous Words. So this was a book that I also found at the beginning of high school that I've never seen a new copy of it. It's a book that's seemed perpetually old. And so it just has like the strangest words. I would go through it at lunchtime and try to find the most preposterously spelled word that I could. And so like some of them would be croakumshire, a croaking sound peculiar to the Northumberland dialect resulting from a supposed inability to sound the letter R. And so you'll on the same page have also a quartbow or a cuggermugger, contopotent. They're hard to pronounce. And so it was just, I'd always loved words from as long as I could read, but this truly sort of opened up to love very strange parts of words.
As best I can tell, there aren't any croakitullers in cross-country cat. Since I have no idea what those are, I couldn't really tell you if they're there or not. But what is in here is a very, very beautifully illustrated and hilariously told story by Mary Calhoun and illustrated by Eric Ingram about our titular cat, who is using pine branches as ski boots and is just gliding across meadows and forests. I hope that the skiers here will immediately go out and buy this book and or make skis for their cats, because if this is any indication, it's going to go really well and there will be some adorable pictures out of it. In this book, the cat named Henry ends up being left accidentally when he goes back to grab his mouse when their family leaves the vacation cabin. And they'd made him skis, but being a cat didn't really go so well the first time. But having no choice, Henry decides to hop on his skis and follow them. And when he does, he encounters some fun things, some not so fun things, and teaches you a lot about how one should ski. I learned how to telegraph and how to like keep a rhythm in skis from this book. My parents really knew what they were doing. And next up, on a completely different note, we have Joseph Campbell's The Power of Myth, written with Bill Moyers. For me, my point of entry for this was the with Bill Moyers part. I first saw Bill Moyers speaking with Joseph Campbell at Skywalker Ranch when I was really young, and I just remember them talking about how Star Wars was modern myth. And being intrigued, I of course opened this up as 12-year-old me and flipped it to the page with Darth Vader on it, and found that the stories of mythology are not something that belong to any particular time or any particular culture, but that myth is something that animates our lives in ways that we don't even realize. I'd never thought of superheroes or science fiction or fantasy as modern myth before. But now that I've been exposed to that idea, I see myth everywhere. And I really am grateful to Campbell and Moyers for showing me that mythology is not just something that belongs to the ancient Greeks, but it's something that's very much alive and breathing with us today.
So it's funny that The Power of Myth should come directly before this, the autobiography of Red. by Anne Carson, because it's like a modern novel in verse that has to do quite a bit with the myth of Heracles and Geryon. So it follows, in the original story, Geryon is a monster. This giant with wings and red skin who guards a cattle pen for Heracles to steal the cattle from, and Heracles kills Geryon on a whim. But instead, Carson approaches this with looking at Geryon being, this young gay man who doesn't really understand all the love that he's feeling for this ennobled person, Heracles. And I remember reading it and never having encountered a similar style before, where so much of what I would have considered prose was now poetry, and it was like gliding along. It was truly one of the most memorable books that I remember reading as a teenager, because it was able to incorporate what I had loved from a very early age, Greek mythology, with more actual literature, as other people would call. So it was a sort of bridge between what I had known before and what I was coming to love.
Oh, this is me. Pema Chodron, When Things Fall Apart. I had avoided Pema Chodron for a long time because I thought, it's like an Oprah thing. And it's like the white lady who found Zen, and now she's going to tell all the white people how to do stuff. And then I started to go through a divorce, and then this book was like randomly in the person's green room that we made the spiritual life contemplation space, and it just kind of called out to me, and I was like, perhaps Pema Chodron has something to say to me. And I basically, my journal was like, for the first year of my grief process, was like half Pema quotes and half just me getting my stuff out, because I like to use this book to get my stuff out. And I don't know, it's just one of those. It's just beautiful, and it's profound, and it's slow, and I'm a person who's just fast, and there's a lot of channels, and so I feel like this is a book that anyone can pick up at any time, difficult or not, and just kind of find a place to kind of get centered. And she's a person who I can really trust, sort of self-help gurus who have seen suffering themselves, and she's seen a lot and been through a lot, and for me this is just really moving. Black theology and Black power. I don't know. It's a little book. So this was my mentor in seminary, my other grad school that I went to, James Cone, and he's the person who, so I don't know if y'all remember Jeremiah Wright, he was Obama's pastor back in the day, and Obama almost didn't get elected because he was associated with this like radical guy. Well, the radical guy was quoting this radical guy, who was my radical teacher, and I was a person who was raised in a liberal-ish Catholic, very white church in Ohio, and I very much rejected everything that I was raised with for lots of, I thought, pretty legit reasons. And then when I was introduced to this whole concept of liberation theology, and of theology as being something that empowers folks who are suffering, and this idea specifically. So Gustavo Gutierrez came up with the concept of liberation theology. James Cone kind of made it famous and made it big in the US. So he's known as the founder of Black liberation theology. And he is, I'm gonna cry when I think about being his student. He's really, really, really prophetic, and really teaching with his whole self and his whole heart and his whole soul. And huge, huge, huge person in the civil rights movement. This came out, I think, in '69. And just a very present force in my life. Sorry.
So my next book, The Book of Lost Things by John Connolly, is a sort of interesting foray for John Connolly, who's typically a mystery writer of very gory stuff. But the first thing that I ever picked up by him was this book. And in the same vein as a lot of these, it centers on archetypes of folk tales and mythology. And so this is about a young boy going through a Bildungsroman, and during the World War II, and having a dead mother who's recently died, and he's slowly learning to speak with books, and then and trying to find out who he is, and then he gets sucked into a sort of other world where he has to face a lot of difficulties that I was having to face at the time of what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do when I'm only 13 as he is and the world is throwing everything at me? It's a very beautiful book. I highly suggest it.
This is How You Lose Her by Junot Diaz. It's a series of short vignettes. Some of them are about different characters, but most of them follow Junior, who is a young Dominican American man. Each vignette is at a different point in his life. And it's from a first-person perspective, and it's like you're supposed to think he's sort of writing this book, and he suggests an alternate title of The Cheater's Guide to Love. So it's sort of like a bunch of love stories, but none of them are happy, and they feel very real. And I feel like I really appreciate it because it complicates this narrative of machismo in Latino culture and shows that it's like really complicated, and also looking at gender within specifically a Dominican American community. Part of it is set in Boston and explores like racism there, and it just feels very true. Me again, I think. The May Trees. Okay, so this is The May Trees by Annie Dillard. Some of you have probably read some of her essays. She's a nature writer and a poet, I believe. So this is a novel, but it's very lyrical. It almost reads like prose poetry. It's also a love story that is not very happy, which is a theme in my books. But it's more about this woman, her personal journey towards like being okay with the world and a love that transcends like romantic love. She and her partner break up early on, but she ends up like nursing his partner later in life, and they have a child together, and it's this whole saga, and it's set on the coast of Maine, so it's like very beautiful scenery, and yeah, it's very good. I am next. So this is The Brothers K by David James Duncan, and so the K is an allusion to the Brothers Karamazov, but it's also, to K is a verb, it means to strike out. So this is also a family saga of about 4 brothers and 2 twin sisters that are pushed off to the side for the most of the time, that are connected by their father's love of baseball. He's this prodigy, and everyone thinks he's going to make it really big, but then he hurts his thumb in a mill accident and can't play anymore. But then slowly starts to recover the ability to play, and so there's like this mythic thing about baseball going on. I hate baseball, but I love playing. And then meanwhile, it's like these 4 brothers are growing up in, it's like the 60s and 70s, and how each of them responds in a different way to this time period in America. Like one like becomes a Buddhist, another is like works in the church, another is like more of this like radical intellectual. It's very good.
The Golden Book of the Civil War is listed as a children's book, but don't let that fool you. It is one of the most comprehensive, beautifully illustrated, well put together history of the Civil War I've ever encountered. And it's a hell of a lot shorter than most of them, which is not a bad thing. It's a book that I picked up when I was traveling at the Bull Run battlefield, Battle of Manassas, which was the first major battle of the Civil War. And I was there with my dad, and we were in the bookstore, and I was young, I was bored. Seems to be a theme from my youth now that I think about it. And once again, as with Phantom Tollbooth, I found a solution in books. And this one really opened my eyes to just how profound the Civil War was in shaping the American consciousness. My father was a Virginian and didn't associate with the Confederacy per se, but at the same time was more in line with the idea of independence being something that had been lost by the South, in addition to the narrative of slavery. And so getting to hear his story juxtaposed with what I was learning in school, juxtaposed with what I found in here, meant that I understood the Civil War to be a lot more complicated and a lot more profound than I give it credit for. And it's easy to read.
So I've chosen two books by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. No One Writes to the Colonel, which is a collection of short stories. The first, before he really established himself as a writer of magical realism, this is an early book, and No One Writes to the Colonel is the lead story, and it tells a tragic and very painful story of a forgotten man and his wife who've been left behind, whose son has died. And its sympathy for elders and its sympathy for people in pain is profound. And it sort of bookends his career because it begins his long history as a writer. Everyone talks about 100 Years of Solitude. That's a wonderful book. But that one and Love in the Time of Cholera, which is a hugely important book about love, I think. It follows a couple who meet as teenagers through their whole lives and who love each other and separate and lead incredibly complex love lives with other people, always keeping in some kind of touch with each other, and then come back and find that they have nothing in common with each other. They're very elderly, return to each other again, refreshes their love in some kind of diminished way, in a tragic way. But it's an amazing tale of pain interwoven with love, and I recommend almost anything by him, but these two are among my favorites.
Thich Nhat Hanh, Miracle of Mindfulness, another book that is kind of ubiquitous and absolutely beautiful, written on retreat by a monk named Thich Nhat Hanh, Vietnamese, and I just want to read. Okay. Washing the dishes to wash the dishes. 30 years ago, when I was still a novice at Tiuhu Pagoda, washing the dishes was hardly a pleasant task. During the season of retreat, when all the monks returned to the monastery, 2 novices had to do all the cooking and wash the dishes for sometimes well over 100 monks. Okay, this is going to be too long. I'm going to tell you, while washing the dishes, one should only be washing the dishes, which means that while washing the dishes, one should be completely aware of the fact that one is washing the dishes. And to me, this is like principle for life and something, as I talked about earlier, so many channels happening. So to just be aware of the one thing that I'm doing is like ultimate life challenge, and I try to apply that to like my work here when I'm with someone, to be with that person, and in my life to be with whatever's going on, and in nature, going for a walk, to just be going for a walk. It is such a challenge in our culture, even living in the middle of nowhere in Marlboro.
A book that comes as a product of a place not in the middle of nowhere. These are the collected poems of Langston Hughes. I picked it in part because when I was doing rapid reviews and I had my list of 800 million books that I had to whittle down to 10, I wanted one of them to reflect my love of poetry. And I ended up settling on Langston Hughes because I think when I read A Dream Deferred, I realized what poetry could do. It's a short poem. It doesn't fill up the page. It uses so few words and it says so much. And I'm just going to read the poem to you. I'm sure it's one of his more famous ones. I'm sure you all have heard it at some point. But I think it can speak for itself better than I can speak for it. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode?
So my next book is We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. And she is rather famous for her short story, The Lottery, which has become pretty huge in our culture today with things like the Hunger Games. But I first, I'd read the short story in high school, but I discovered this book at actually the mystery bookstore in town. It was the first book that I bought in Brattleboro. And I devoured it very, very quickly. It concerns Mary Cat and her sister Constance, who have their life, who sequester themselves off with a rather crazy uncle, and then have their life invaded by a relative. And it's about a girl who, is a little off her rocker, and who is not seen as desirable by society, but who creates her own world. And I, having come to Vermont and feeling very, very alone, felt that it was a terrific first book to read here.
This is On the Mystery by Catherine Keller. She was my other mentor at seminary, and this is the one book that she's written that people who don't have like PhDs in theology could actually read. It's an introduction to ecofeminist process theology, and she kind of invented this form of being theopoetics, and it's sort of like theology and obviously poetry. And this book is for anyone. So it's an intro to process theology. Process theology was became in 1925 based on quantum physics, basically, and it's kind of like a hybrid pseudo-Christianity based on Zen Buddhism. And it's sort of this idea that like God is an entity that's always in motion, and it takes away any kind of like Western sort of omnipotence and omnipresence. Well, actually it's omnipresent. The whole idea that like God is apart from us, as like a big director up in the sky, is kind of brought into God as within us, but it's still divinity rather than just an energy. And it's beautiful, and it's funny, and it's playful, and it's a really great way for anyone who's felt sort of oppressed by Western religion and the spiritual but not religious crowd. If you secretly want to go to church but you feel like you'd be stupid or be made fun of, you can read this and then justify why you like to like have communion or something.
This is Big Sur by Jack Kerouac. I really love road stories, but I really hate On the Road. I feel like Big Sur is one of his later books, and it feels a little more down to earth. Even the prose is more coherent, and he's really come to terms with his alcoholism in this book. But it's not entirely, it's very depressing, but it's also not. It's like he goes down the 101 and he goes to this house by this Big Sur by himself, and it's like beautiful, and he has this moment of clarity where he's like, shit, I'm an alcoholic. And you're like, yeah, Jack, you can do it. You can guess what happens. But it's very beautiful, and it's still a road story, and it still has all those elements that people, I think, do love from On the Road, but it's more relatable.
Barbara Kingsolver, The Bean Trees. Barbara Kingsolver is just a beautiful, beautiful storyteller, and she's a biologist, and I read this when I was like 20, and I just dropped out of college, and I moved out west from the Midwest, and Barbara was just sort of an intro to like living out west for me, and this is technically Southwest, but a lot of the books I liked as a young white kid really, really walked the margins on like cultural appropriation, and as I kind of learned, like, so she's this white woman who adopts a little like orphan and names her Turtle, and I think she's a Central American refugee, like, so it gets tricky, but I think, I haven't read this in like 20 years, so it might be problematic now with more of what I've learned and grown about, but one of Prodigal Summer is one of her most recent books, and I'll just say Barbara Kingsolver, huge influence on my life. This book was sort of a, when you drop out of college and you're going and doing a thing and you need a beautiful story, this is a beautiful story. I also have some mother-daughter stuff, and so this was a nice thing to read some mother-daughter stuff that was kind of a beautiful thing.
So, it's been a while since I did a book. So this is Fargo Rock City by Chuck Klosterman. Chuck Klosterman is one of my favorite essayists / pop cultureists. He's well known for his book, Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs. This book is fantastic in that it is a memoir of a child growing up in a small North Dakota town of about 500 people discovering heavy metal music and realizing that you can tell your own life story through music. And it's a combination of reviews and recollections. My two favorite chapters follow one after the other. The first one is February 1st, 1987, subtitled My Mom Makes Stew for Supper. And the second is April 18th, 1987, MTV premieres Headbangers Ball at 11 p.m. And you can feel how much that was important to Chuck growing up. He got into this type of music from his brother, bringing home like a Motley Crue tape. Anyway, really good book. But I get to go again. So, I am not a science person. I am far from a science person. This is The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas S. Kuhn. This is probably the most influential book that I was forced to read, hated reading it, and then realized that it is everywhere. I was given this book at my last college to read as a part of my, it was a hybrid science and English class, and my English professor handed it to me and said, you have to read this book. Not only because I'm going to give you a test at the end, but you are going to find this book in every class you take from now on. And you might not realize it now, but you will. And this book covers paradigms and paradigm shifts, and it's the history of science, but it's the history of science in a way that relates to humanities students. I can't tell you while working on Plan and looking at various articles how many times this book has been cited. And it's absolutely amazing, and it took me 2 reads to figure that out.
So, when I was choosing books, I started off thinking of all-time favorites, but then I thought about what books have been interesting to me more recently, and my choices are a mixture. And this is a wonderful new book by Jill Lepore about a very strange family. A family built of a guy named William Moulton Marsden and several women. First his wife, second a mistress, and third the mistress of his mistress. And they raise a hybrid family together. Moulton had an immense ego and invented the lie detector machine and thought of himself as a kind of hero in his own mind. But he also was very interested in feminism, and he adored all 3 of his partners, and it was a kind of combination of all 3 of his partners that caused him to create the character of Wonder Woman. And he didn't draw Wonder Woman, but he presented her to those that could draw, and he created a feminist hero. And it's a fascinating, hilarious story. Jill Lepore is a great researcher.
Oh, got it. Okay. The Great Escape is the book that unfortunately is out of print, and so the wonderful librarians tried so hard to find it. It is Silas, forever emblazoned on my arm, is the main character. This is a book written in the early 70s from an artist, by an artist in New York City, and it's very much a tale of morality. So it's called The Great Escape, or The Sewer Story, and it's about rich New York City tourists who go to Florida and adopt baby alligators and bring them home to showcase them. But then when they start to get too big and like try to steal your steak, they get flushed down the toilets. And so the alligators create a secret society underground, and all the while there's all this commentary above ground, and there's little people littering, and there's subway graffiti, and there's truant little kids, and so the alligators build a whole culture down under the sewers, and they charter a plane. This is Silas disguised as a woman opening a bank account. They have a whole apartment building. They charter a plane, and then they eventually throw off their disguises and parachute to their freedom into the Everglades and celebrate every holiday with all of their long-lost relatives. And they're all singing happy birthday and happy Kwanzaa and happy Hanukkah and Kwanzaa. Best book ever in the universe for my soul and for the whole world, I think.
This is How Racism Takes Place by George Lipsitz. This is one of the most important books to me for my plan. There was a lot I didn't understand about race and racism, which was hard when you're writing about race. So I would say things to my plan sponsor, like, I don't really think like this is necessary, or like community organizing in Chinatown is necessarily about racism. And she just like looks at me archly and she's like, you need to read this again. So I read this probably like 8 times. And George Lipsitz was actually on the dissertation committee for Kate's dissertation, so it's pretty cool. So it's about how like you can see how structural and institutional racism is most visible in space and the way places are constructed. So it's good if you feel like you need a better understanding of those forces, and also if you need fodder and better talking points for arguing with someone who doesn't know anything.
So I may have mistranscribed the book that I meant to indicate here. James Lord wrote about Alberto Giacometti several times. He wrote this small book called A Portrait, but he also wrote a much bigger book called A Biography, and that's the one that I'm talking about. But it doesn't matter. We have them both in the library if you're interested. Lord was intimate of Giacometti's, and what was fascinating to me about this book was how he places Giacometti at the center of an intellectual world, an intellectual and artistic world that included Picasso and Balthus and Stravinsky and Jean-Paul Sartre and a vast array of people in Europe at a certain moment. Giacometti had been a sculptural hero of mine, and to hear him placed within the wider world of intellect and culture was tremendously influential for me.
Looks like it's me again. Okay, this is Asterios Polyp. I am a huge fan of graphic novels as art form and as literature. This one, it pains me to read it. It's so stunning, it's so beautiful, it's so wonderful. It's the story of a man, an architectural professor at Cornell, it's fictional, who on his 50th birthday, his Manhattan apartment gets struck by lightning and burns to the ground, and he goes on a quest. And essentially it parallels the Odyssey, and really explores the downfall and of his life and the collapse of his marriage and his relationship with his child and his history. And the artwork is fantastic and very minimalistic, and I love it so much. And it's 4 colors and only 4 colors and relies on the lines. And it's breathtaking, and I don't need to say any more about this, but again, this was really one of those, I noticed that it wasn't in the library, and I hope that someone, even if I almost hope that someone who's not in this room discovers this book.
I'm back. Thomas McGuan, 92 in the Shade. I grew up on Cape Cod, and fishing was a big part of my youth. My dad was a great fisherman. He taught me a lot about it. And one year we took a trip to the Florida Keys, and we fished for bonefish and the other fish that are live down there. And we were introduced to this world of fishing guides and the intensity of the heat in the Florida Keys. And McGuan's story is about a young man who goes away from the Keys, returns, and decides to become a fish guide, even though the world is a closed world, even though the world is one that resists him, and in fact, disastrous results occur. But his language is immaculate. I've tried to find other books by Thomas McGuan that were as evocative or as well written and failed, but this one is a real winner.
This is called Material World, a Global Family Portrait. It's been around for a while. Probably a lot of you might have seen it, but I think it was like early 90s when this came out, 94. And this was just a really, A, like I'm kind of obsessed with maps, and B, for me, kind of grown up, small town, Midwest, Ohio, this to me is just both a beautiful just photo essay of like people who are very different than me, and a giant wake-up call about what people might own in an entire household in another culture versus what folks in the US might own. And I really just wish there was more time to just pass it around. This is one of those books you don't necessarily need to check out. You just like sit at the counter and just read it. But it's just really beautiful. They've since done some more photo essays, but I think honestly the cover where it's just like the white North American family, I think they're US family, they just have so much stuff. And folks in other places, you know, especially in developing countries, they just don't have much. And just how that translates to how we consume and our relationship to our stuff, I think is fascinating.
The Crucible by Arthur Miller is one of those books that doesn't really need introduction, in part because it's not a book, it's a play. And I picked it because of that. It's one that represents my love of theater, and as I was trying to think of, again, books that kind of encapsulate my relationship with the written word, The Crucible was one that came out. But beyond just the form of theater and wanting to give it a salute in the form of this tribute, it was also about what I was thinking about when I first read The Crucible. So I encountered The Crucible in my sophomore year of high school, in the midst of kind of the war in Iraq and our post 9/11 world. And I'd been reading about McCarthyism, and The Crucible, of course, tells about the witch hunts and how accusations were thrown around without proof and how an atmosphere of hysteria could be manipulated to hurt people. And I saw great parallels in the war on terror, in all of the ambiguities surrounding that, in the notion that someone who can be accused of terrorism, that word can eliminate due process, eliminate reflective thought. And John Proctor's anguished cry of, at least you've taken all else, let me have my name, is one that spoke to the power of dignity in a world that can try to take it from us.
Mine is considerably more lighthearted. It's Anne of Green Gables by Ellen Montgomery, which was perhaps the first book in the first series to truly capture my heart. I began reading the Anne of Green Gables series when I was perhaps 9, and I discovered it in the nursery of my grandmother's house. It had been a cast-off from my aunt decades prior. And so it follows a red-haired orphan girl who's been adopted in Prince Edward Island, and she's discovering, she's always has this beautiful imagination that could get her through anything, but she's discovering what human interaction can also do, along with all the things that she keeps up in her head, and so like, watching the movies, which I highly suggest, like the Megan Follow movies are terrific, and reading the books and being a little red-headed girl with too much imagination, it was almost like reading a book about myself, and so in ways I wanted to model myself on Anne, in other ways I decided to be decidedly unlike Anne, and all in all I feel like it really shaped me.
This is Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. This is the last book that I really cried a lot reading. I read an article, a brief scrap of an interview with Toni Morrison, who says that she often writes books with no white characters at all, and I think this book picks up on a piece of that. It's like, what does Black liberation and Black identity look like that's not in talking to white identity at all? And specifically like connections to the land and like ownership of land and labor. And there was a quote I wrote down the page number that I was going to read you. It's at the very end, but it doesn't give a ton away. So this is the main character, Milkman, to his aunt. It says, now he knew why he loved her so. Without ever leaving the ground, she could fly. There must be another one like you, he whispered to her. There's got to be at least one more woman like you.
I also chose a book by Toni Morrison called Paradise, and it equally made me cry. It's a very complicated puzzle of a book. It's very layered and told in multiple time frames. Chapters are named after all the women characters, and we hear the story told from many points of view, but it isn't until after 3 or 4 chapters that one can really begin to piece the story together. It's also about an all-black community, a black township in Oklahoma that had survived without being disturbed by the surrounding white culture until the time frame of the book, and how it's contrasted with a kind of monastery that's nearby, or kind of community of women, and it's bloody and violent, but pieced together in such an intricate way that it's a miracle of writing.
Oh, this book. So this is The Inner Side of the Wind by Milorad Pavic. It was translated from Croatian into English. It is the most beautiful written book, but it's fascinating. It is subtitled The Novel of Hero and Leander, and it is a retelling of the myth of Hero and Leander. However, it is written in a very unique way in that you can start the book this way or you can start the book this way. And one side of the book is Hero's story and one side of the book is Leander's story. I haven't read this book in 15 years, but it always stayed with me. It's extremely out of print and hard to find, and I'm really glad that they found it.
Go, Rachel.
And it's fascinating in that this love story, it's a tragic love story that, much like Hero and Leander, spread across a sea, but in this time it's not a sea, water sea, but it's a sea of time, in that Leander's story takes place in the 1700s and Hero's story takes place in the early 1900s. And they are connected in many ways, and I'm going again next, aren't I? Yes. They're connected in many ways, and no matter which side you start with, you find the connections. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, it's amazing, and it's rare, and I'm going to be really sad if it disappears from the library. Oh, Terry Pratchett. So, Terry Pratchett passed away earlier this year, and I'm kind of really glad that I chose this book a long time ago before then. This is one of the Discworld novels. There's like 50 of them. This is one of my favorites, and it's a standalone. It tells a story, it's Small Gods, by the way. It tells the story of a god who is reincarnated or becomes a turtle and is dropped from the sky into the back of the monastery that worships him as a great god. And the person who finds him and realizes that he is the god that they've been worshipping is just a lowly sweeper. And when he explains, oh no, our god is a turtle now, he's banished. And they go on this adventure, and it's an examination of religion, and it's funny, and it's sweet, and it's touching, and I love it. Boom.
So I have Grimm's Complete Fairy Tales, and so fairy tales, Grimm's fairy tales in particular, have shaped the stories that we all tell today. Like Ian could tell us about the power of myth, and this is in the same way that where there are archetypes and the types of stories that we tell again and again. The book that I requested particularly was an edition of this, where it's 50 selected tales by the author Philip Pullman, who wrote The Golden Compass. And he writes specifically his introductions to the tales and edits them slightly. But I think it's a very Western-centric sort of fairy tale just collection, but I believe it's necessary for people to know about the stories that influence what they read today. So I think it's a very important book.
Jitterbug Perfume, Tom Robbins. This is my favorite book of all time. I'm not going to even tell you anything about it. I'm going to say it's a love story. It also passes through time, and I'm just going to start reading until the buzzer stops. The beet is the most intense of vegetables. The radish, admittedly, is more feverish, but the fire of the radish is a cold fire, the fire of discontent, not of passion. Tomatoes are lusty enough, yet there runs through tomatoes an undercurrent of frivolity. Beets are deadly serious. Slavic peoples get their physical characteristics from potatoes, their smoldering inquietude from radishes, their seriousness from beets. The beet is the melancholy vegetable, the one most willing to suffer. You can't squeeze blood out of a turnip. I love this book. My copy has underlines everywhere. I've loaned it out to 15 people and got it back with more underlines that made me happier. I love it. Read it. If you haven't read it, read it more. Read it again if you have.
So this is Fran and Zoe by J.D. Salinger. It's a novel split into two halves about a brother and sister. The first half is about Franny, and it takes place almost entirely in a booth in a diner for the whole story, and it's like set in the 50s, I think, and it's this very like, hey, how you doing, da da da, like thing going on. But it slowly like devolves, and you see that like Franny is like having this breakdown, and then it stops with like Franny like losing her shit in the bathroom. And then the second half is about her brother, Zoe, and it takes place almost entirely in a bathroom with Zoe in the tub and his mother talking to him from outside of the tub. And so it's this like quirky like Royal Tenenbaums thing going on, but then you quickly realize like there's this deeper thing happening where like Franny's trying to figure out like how to be an ethical human being, and so is Zoe, and like they have this weird family thing to figure out. And so there was one quote I want to read you really quickly about Mrs. Glass. Can I do it? Okay. The door opened. The door opened and Mrs. Glass, a medium stout woman in a hairnet, sidled into the bathroom. Her age, under any circumstance, was fiercely indeterminate, but never more so than when she was wearing a hairnet. Her entrances into rooms were usually verbal as well as physical. I don't know how you can stay in the tub the way you do. She closed the door behind her instantly, as someone does who has been waging a long, long war on behalf of her progeny against post-bath drafts. It isn't even healthy, she said. Do you know how long you've been in that tub? Exactly 45. Don't tell me, just don't tell me, Bessie. What do you mean, don't tell you? Just what I said. Leave me the goddamn illusion you haven't been out there counting the minutes I've... Nobody's been counting any minutes, young man, Mrs. Glass said.
So my next book is Civil War Land and Bad Decline by George Saunders. George Saunders is by far my favorite short story writer. He is very postmodern and discusses what it's like to be apathetic in a society which is apathetic towards you. So there's a lot of absurdism, a lot of surrealism, a lot of ghosts. This is his first collection of short stories. And it was the last one that I read of all of his books. It's probably the least effective to someone else, but to me, to read the titular story, Civil War Land and Bad Decline, about a man who was falling apart and trying to keep a theme park alive, and trying to keep his family alive, and trying to ward off a series of ghosts who are just intent on making him miserable, and on hooligans who don't care about anything. I mean, it's a true look into.
Oh no, I can't turn it off there.
What's going on? You received a call? I think that Saunders is an incredible writer, very short, very punchy, very, 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 very smart, and I think that everyone should read at least one of his stories. It didn't matter anyway, because the next one's mine. So Atlas of Remote Islands by Judith Schlansky. It's a German translation, and apparently very hard to find, even though it's pretty recent. So this book combines my absolute love of maps, along with vignettes. So the like usual thing of it is that you have an illustration done specifically for the book of the island, and then a story based on a true story of whoever was living there, written by Judith Schlansky. And one of the important things about the book that I really love is the subtitle to it, 50 Islands I've Never Set Foot On and Never Will. And so it's much less about the truth of a place, even though that certainly factors into it. It's much more about our imaginings of it and how we can romanticize a place. And for me as a traveler, that can be both good and bad.
So next I have the Illuminatus trilogy by Robert Shea and Robert Anton Wilson. I have a love affair with the bizarre and the science fiction-y without being too science fiction-y type books. If you have ever been interested in conspiracy theories, or have ever read Pynchon, or ever been kind of wary of what lies beneath the surface, this is a great book to read. It plays with the reader a lot. There, at one point, all of the characters turn to the reader and start accusing them of things. It purports to explain the Kennedy assassination, the John Birch Society, all sorts of everything that you could ever want. There's a part that takes place in space, there's a part that takes place in the oceans. It's fantastic. It's a really tricky read, but it's a really rewarding read. Most people I know who've read it or started to read it will either put it down or can't put it down. If you put it down within the first 20 pages, this book's not for you. But if you make it past the first 20, you're probably going to make it through the 770.
This is Sweet Thursday by John Steinbeck. It's the sequel to Cannery Row. So if you've read it before, it's like the main cast of characters. Doc, this marine biologist, has just gotten back from World War II, and the cannery has closed, and so it's set in this coastal town. It's Monterey before Monterey is what it is today. It's like a small coastal fishing town, and it's been overfished, and there's a lot of poverty, and most of what there is like a brothel and a small grocery store. And so it's just these characters. I don't know how to describe it exactly. It's like a good portrait of this small town and characters that represent like larger themes and trends at this time in America. And it's Steinbeck.
If there's a book in my stack here that constitutes a kind of a core book for me, it's this one, Selected Poems of Wallace Stevens. Wallace Stevens was led an interesting life. Besides being known as a poet, he was actually an insurance executive and lived in Hartford, Connecticut, and worked at his job till he died, while creating one of the most impressive set of poems in American literature. He liked having another job. He liked being able to go and have an ordinary life. He wrote most of his poems while walking around. He had a tremendous memory. He could write in his head and come home at night and transcribe it. There's a poem called An Ordinary Evening in New Haven, which I've been working on for about 20 years now and have written about. Anybody who's taken a course from me has probably read some Wallace Stevens. He writes largely about the nature of the imagination vis-a-vis the nature of reality, and how those two things are necessary simultaneously to construct the world. And that subject is my subject.
Here we've got Darkest Visible, a memoir of madness by William Styron. You may know Styron better as the author of Pulitzer Prize winner for Confessions of Nat Turner. But this book is about Styron the man. It talks about his remembering a fall into severe depression that completely incapacitated him. And as someone who's gone through multiple major depressive episodes myself, I discovered this book when I was in the middle of one. And for an experience that defies language, that can only be approached via metaphor, I've never found anything that could get inside the head of a mind that is losing itself and losing its sense of self, unlike Styron's. This is the one that I made my dad read when I was trying to help him understand what I was going through. And it's one that I keep by my bedside because for all of the agony and the torture that I know through my own life and that Styron describes, he says that the best thing that can be said of depression is that it ends. And that's something that I needed to hear and may very well need to hear again. And I think it's something that should be said and said over and over and over and over again.
Lovely. Well said. So Dylan Thomas's collection of poems is the book that really got me involved in poetry. If I hadn't sort of grown up to be a sculptor, I probably would have grown up to be a poet, largely because of this book. Thomas writes, he was a Welshman, he writes in a kind of lyrical, descriptive, and elegant prose that is musical and wonderful to hear. It took me a long time to kind of come to terms with the parts of his poetry that weren't so good, which I think I have a better handle on now, and the parts of his own life that were troubled. But he was an early hero to me and somebody who I still read Poem in October once a year because it was written on his birthday, and I sort of give it to myself as a birthday present every year.
When's your birthday, Tim?
January.
Uh-huh.
Next one's you too.
Oh, that's me too.
Sorry to give you the trail.
I read a lot of biographies. I've used to read more fiction. I'm reading many more biographies these days. Calvin Tompkins writes for the New Yorker a lot, and he has written on a wide variety of subjects, not just about art. But this biography of Marcel Duchamp kind of the most pivotal artist in the early 20th century through the mid 20th century, who began his career in France and later moved to the United States, and who has been tremendously influential for every artist that I know, is written by somebody who really understands the work. It doesn't just understand the life and the circumstances that surrounded the artist, but he writes like someone who has lived a life of trying to understand and grapple with art. And so not only is he writing the circumstances and the events of Marcel Duchamp's life, but he's writing about the work in as perceptible way as I've ever read.
So my last book is The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making by Catherine Infalente. And as you can probably tell from the title, it's an incredibly charming book, as most of my selection is. And so, like, if you look under what is classified as, it's children's fiction. But for me, I read this when I was not a child. In fact, it was not published when I was young. I guess I'm still young, but we get illusions of grandeur here. But this is a book that is about a little girl named September who's 12. I guess she's bored with her life, and instead of all of those heroines who get caught up like Dorothy in a storm, she decides to take her own fate and goes along on an adventure to fairyland. It is perhaps my very favorite book of all of these, mostly because it makes me so incredibly happy inside to read it. The language is beautiful, poignant, funny, and it's an incredible book for any reader.
My last book is The Temple of My Familiar by Alice Walker, and when I'm thinking about how I came upon this, I think I was really thinking about what a Marlboro student might like, and I was thinking about myself around college age time. And I also had big plans to reread these because I haven't read this in so long that I can't remember a lot of details, but I can remember that it was extremely important to me. And I'm thinking about grand theme. It's like rich, deep fiction that's mythical. It's kind of a creation myth-ish. And I remember reading it as if it were fact. And I think it still might be, maybe. It was sort of like women, it was a matriarchal society. It's somewhere, I think, in sub-Saharan Africa, with like women hanging out with lions. And the men basically worshipped them. And then there was a point where the men realized that their sperm is what made the babies, and the women needed that. And then it's this whole kind of switch of like how we got into patriarchy, and the men start domesticating dogs, and they start like effing with the lions and the women, and they become violent. And it's kind of cultural critique / myth / beauty fiction. And I was thinking about how I kind of became politicized by a lot of myth. And then it's funny that I ended up in like theology school doing, I don't know, it's all sort of interconnected, I guess.
I, for one, am grateful for typos because it allows me to talk about my very favorite book last.
Yeah. No, not another one.
It's all right. No. It's the fact that Zin wasn't the last one.
Oh,
Yeah, I moved up to the top. WW is right there toward the end. So, okay, can my minute start now?
That's fair.
Thank you. Wow, I didn't get away with that. All right, then. This book is utterly beautiful. Once and Future King is the story of King Arthur. But it's not quite like the story of King Arthur you've ever heard, because it's not terribly boring and it's not super violent. I've read Le Morte d'Arthur. This is funny. This book is fun, and making King Arthur fun is a real trick. It's 5 volumes, each of which tell kind of the tragedy of Arthur's rise and fall. My favorite part is probably the first section, where he's just a boy named the Wart, with no delusions of grandeur whatsoever, who has to run off into a forest in search of a hawk that he'd been hawking with, and he just decided to go away. And he runs into Merlin, who is this just bedraggled figure. The description's hilarious. Merlin's going backwards through time, so he can never remember what he said, only what he's going to say. He's got an owl named Archimedes. You meet all the characters you'd met, but rather than these mythic figures being mythic figures, these mythic figures are fully realized people. Everyone should read this one.
So looks like I'm the last one. Is that true? Wow. Okay. So it's interesting to me because I started with an autobiography, and I'm ending with an actual autobiography. This is the real Frank Zappa book by Frank Zappa. Pet personal love of mine. I love Frank Zappa's work. He's a very prolific musician, and this book is hilarious. It charts his life the way he wants to tell it, from his youth in Maryland up until the late 80s in the censorship trials that he was testifying at. It's very funny. It's goes from one time period to another. It's not very linear, but it also gives a lot of insight into the way he thought and the way he worked, and a lot of insight into his music that I wasn't expecting to say. I read this first when I was about 14 years old and have read it a few times since. And my time is up, and so was his.
Well done.